They say dignity is not something you demand, but something you carry with you, quietly, firmly, through every step. Some people shout to be heard, but others, they only need silence because silence carries more weight than noise. This is the story of Harold Vance, a blind veteran who asked for nothing more than a simple Tuesday walk. But life placed him in the middle of injustice, and what followed was something no one on that street expected. If stories of quiet courage and dignity touch your heart, make sure to follow, like, and share your thoughts, because every voice matters when we choose to listen. The city was already alive when Harold Vance stepped onto the sidewalk, his cane tapping a rhythm only he knew. The air smelled faintly of exhaust and sugar, bus fumes mixing with the scent of fresh pastries drifting from the corner bakery. His steps were steady, practiced, unhurried. Left foot, tap of the cane. Right foot, pause. 4 years of walking this route had carved it into his memory. He had never been one to ask for help. Not when he came home from Vietnam, not when his eyesight failed him years later, and certainly not on this Tuesday morning. His destination was simple, the VA clinic after his first coffee of the day. The young man behind the counter always knew his order. "Black, no sugar," he said softly, handing it over like Harold was doing him a favor. Harold liked that, respect without spectacle. With the cup warm in his hand, he set off again. Children's laughter echoed faintly from a playground 2 blocks away. The city hurried, but Harold didn't. He listened harder than most, felt more than others did. Blindness didn't dull the world, it sharpened everything else. When he reached the corner of 5th and Adams, he stopped. Cane resting lightly at the edge of the curb, he waited. The signal hadn't chirped yet, and Harold knew better than to trust silence. His ear tilted toward the flow of traffic, ready for the sound of brakes, the hiss of the bus that always came at 10:17. Then, the voice cut through, sharp, too sharp. "Iced to step back." Harold turned slightly toward it. A young cop, he guessed, tense from the stiffness in his tone. Maybe his first week, maybe just overeager. Harold lifted his cane an inch, his voice calm. "I'm waiting for the walk signal." Boots scraped against concrete. The officer shifted his stance. "You're standing too close to tarmac. Step back, please." Harold's foot found the groove in the sidewalk that ran parallel to the street. He knew it well. He'd stood here countless times. "I'm not in the street," he said evenly. "I know where the line is." The crosswalk signal chirped once, then paused. Harold waited for the next 3 beeps, the rhythm that meant it was safe to cross. But the voice came again, louder this time. "You're holding up cars. Step back now." Harold's grip tightened slightly on the cane. His voice stayed steady, low. "I told you, I'm blind. I'm not trying to cause anything. I just need to cross." For a heartbeat, there was silence. Then Harold felt it, the shift of air behind him, fabric brushing, the subtle rattle of gear. His trained senses recognized the movement even before the sound came. The crackle, a burst of electricity, and then pain. The world spun once, then narrowed. His shoulder slammed into the pavement, his cane clattering out of reach. The breath tore from his chest, ribs aching from the fall. A woman screamed, another voice sharp with outrage. "He said he was blind! What are you doing?" Feet pounded against the concrete, rushing closer. A man's voice rang out, steady and furious. "I got the whole thing on video." But Harold stayed still, one hand pressing against the warm pavement, not because he couldn't move, but because he refused to become a spectacle. He had learned long ago that sometimes the best way to stand tall was to stay down until the noise shifted. The officer's uneven pacing reached Harold's ears. Nervous breaths, restless boots scraping again and again. Not fear of consequences, Harold thought, just fear of being seen. Too late for that. The woman's voice rose again, trembling with fury, but not with fear. "He said he was blind. You didn't hear him?" No one helped Harold up, not yet. Some held their phones aloft, their screens reflecting fragments of the truth. Others stood frozen, watching, unsure of what to do with their own discomfort. Finally, someone knelt close and pressed something into Harold's hand, the smooth, familiar handle of his cane. "Your cane's right here," she said softly. Harold's grip closed tight. "Thank you." He pushed himself up slowly, steady as ever, refusing to rush. The taser wires tugged at his coat, but he ignored them. His breath came low and even. His presence alone silenced some of the crowd. The officer finally spoke. "Sir, you failed to comply with a verbal command." Harold turned his head just enough to face him. Though blind, the weight of his voice carried like a gaze. "I told you I was blind." The words cut without anger. Not heat, not bitterness, just truth. The officer's radio crackled. "Unit 12, do you copy? What's your status?" "Yeah, I copy," the officer replied stiffly. "Civilian is up, requesting transport and backup." Civilian, not a man, not a veteran, just another box to check. Harold shifted his cane, his legs still stiff from the shock. He took one slow step toward the curb. The woman who had given him back his cane hovered just far enough away, not to smother, but to stand with him. "You sure you're okay?" she asked softly. Harold nodded faintly. "I've had worse," he said, his voice carrying weight. "Much worse." Then came another sound, low at first, then rising. A thrum beneath the asphalt, heavy and measured. Harold's head tilted slightly. He knew it instantly. Diesel engines, thick wheels, not city vehicles, not civilian. The crowd began to murmur. Someone whispered, "That's not police." And then it came into view. The first truck, green and boxy, an American flag painted on the door. No sirens, no urgency, just presence. Behind it, another, then a third. The engines rolled forward, unbothered by lights or sirens. They came with a weight that didn't need permission. The crowd stepped back instinctively, not from fear, but something closer to reverence. The officer froze, his stance rigid, jaw clenched tight. His hand hovered at his belt but did not move. The convoy eased to a stop just feet from the crosswalk. A hiss of brakes, a door creaked open. Boots struck pavement with measured steps. Harold didn't move. He stood facing the sound, shoulders squared, waiting. And then came the voice. Calm, steady, certain. "Sergeant Harold Vance." Harold turned slightly toward it, his lips pressed into a line. "That's me." The crowd fell silent. The street held its breath. Something had shifted, and everyone could feel it. The boots stopped just short of Harold, and the air shifted with a different kind of authority. Not the loud kind, not the restless kind of a rookie officer grasping for control. This one was quieter, heavier, born from history. The soldier spoke again, his tone clipped but respectful. "That's me," Harold had said, and in return came a small nod he could hear more than see. "I thought so." Behind the first voice, more doors opened. Boots touched down, steady and synchronized. 2, 3, then more. They did not rush. They did not crowd. Their silence carried more weight than the officer's radio ever could. The crowd's murmurs died quickly, replaced by that strange reverence that comes when people sense something older than the moment. Phones still hovered in hands, but some lowered, unsure if recording this felt right. The officer who had fired the taser stood rigid, his breath uneven, the scrape of his boots betraying nerves. His hand hovered near his belt, but he did not draw his weapon. He didn't even touch his radio. His voice, when it finally came, cracked under its own uncertainty. "Civilian failed to comply," he muttered, as if anyone was listening. No one was. Harold straightened slowly, cane tapping once against the pavement. His shoulder throbbed from the fall, his ribs still aching, but his voice carried steady when he spoke. "You didn't need to know who I was," he said flatly, directed toward the officer. "You just needed to listen." The words struck harder because they were quiet, unheeded. The crowd shifted, some stepping back, others leaning forward, holding their breath for what might come next. A woman's voice from earlier rose again, firm and sharp. "He told you." We all heard him. Her anger was still there, but steadier now, shaped into something unshakable. The soldier standing before Harold didn't look at the officer, didn't acknowledge him at all. Instead, his attention remained fixed on Harold. "Sir," he said, "would you allow us to escort you off the street?" "I'm fine," Harold answered, his cane tapping lightly once more. "But I appreciate the offer." Another nod, respect given and returned. The crowd felt the shift more than they saw it. The authority of the street no longer belonged to the officer or to the police car idling crooked at the curb. It had passed to something older, something carried in uniforms with history stitched into their seams. The engines of the trucks idled low, their sound filling the block with a presence that needed no explanation. No one ordered them to stay. They simply did. The woman who had handed Harold his cane moved closer again, arms crossed now, her stance protective but not intrusive. She wasn't trembling anymore. She wasn't even angry. She was watching, waiting as if certain something larger was unfolding. The officer shifted his stance once more, one foot dragging back across the concrete. His voice rose, too loud against the quiet. I didn't know who he was. Harold tilted his head slightly toward the sound, his face unreadable. You didn't have to know, he repeated softer this time, almost like a lesson spoken into the air. You just had to listen. The silence that followed wasn't empty, it was heavy, filled with the truth hanging there for everyone present. From across the street, a child's small voice whispered to his mother, "Is he a hero?" The mother didn't answer. She only squeezed the child's hand tighter, eyes fixed on the blind man standing in the crosswalk with soldiers at his side. Harold adjusted his coat, squaring his shoulders a little more. The pain still burned along his ribs, but he would not bend to it. Not here, not now. He had carried heavier weights in quieter places. The soldier in front of him spoke again, his tone calm but edged with certainty. 19th Infantry, Fort Lewis. You served 32 years and you're still standing. A faint smile flickered across Harold's lips, more felt than seen. Then I trust you know what you're doing. Yes, you. No one clapped, no one cheered. The crowd didn't need noise. What filled the street now was something beyond applause. A man lowered his phone and whispered to the person beside him, "He's one of them." The reply came hushed but clear. Yeah, and that cop tased him like he was nobody. The officer flinched as if the words struck him physically. His jaw tightened, his shoulders dropped slightly, and for the first time since the taser fired, he looked smaller in his own uniform. Harold turned his head toward him once more, not quickly, not with force, but with the slow precision of a man who had no need to prove himself. The officer didn't move. You just had to listen, Harold said again, his voice level, without bitterness. The words hung in the air, heavier now, carried not only by Harold's presence, but by the quiet authority of the men standing behind him. No one rushed to break the silence. Even the city itself seemed to pause. The hum of traffic muted, the world holding still as if recognizing the weight of the moment. The woman beside Harold looked toward the convoy, her eyes narrowing slightly with curiosity. What is this? She whispered, more to herself than to anyone else. But Harold already knew. He had felt it in the rumble of engines before the first truck appeared. This was not for show. This was recognition, arriving not with ceremony, but with quiet force. The officer's radio crackled again, but he didn't touch it. His hands hung stiff at his sides, his voice lost. The soldiers remained still, their posture calm yet unyielding, as if declaring silently that Harold was no longer alone on that crosswalk. And Harold, cane steady in hand, stood taller than the moment itself. His quiet presence, unshaken by pain, carried the dignity that no taser could strip away. The balance of the street had shifted completely. No longer about commands barked by a nervous voice, no longer about a single misjudgment. It had become something larger, about listening, about truth, about dignity too long overlooked. Harold let the silence hold. He did not rush to fill it. Some truths didn't need volume, they only needed to be carried. The engines continued to hum, steady as a heartbeat. The officer's breath faltered again, uneven. The crowd stayed hushed, waiting, as if something still lingered on the edge of happening. Harold tilted his head slightly, as though listening not to the officer, not to the soldiers, but to the city itself. For the first time in a long while, the city was listening back, and that was enough. If this story has touched you so far, don't forget to follow and share your thoughts. Every quiet voice helps stories like this find their way forward. The soldier who had spoken first did not raise his voice. He didn't need to. Authority was carried in the measured weight of his words, and in the way the other soldiers behind him shifted their posture slightly straighter at his presence. "Sergeant Harold Vance," he repeated, more like a greeting than a roll call. Harold gave a small nod. "That's me." His tone was steady, stripped of ceremony, as though he were confirming nothing more than his name at a clinic counter. But in the silence that followed, the truth of who he was hung heavier than any rank could suggest. The crowd leaned in without meaning to. Some still clutched their phones, but the urge to record was fading into something else, into reverence, into the sense that this was not a moment to capture, but one to witness. The officer who had fired the taser remained frozen, his face pale, his stance unbalanced. His hand hovered awkwardly near his belt, but never touched it. He opened his mouth once, but no sound came. The soldier closest to Harold turned slightly, not toward the officer, but toward the men behind him. "Hold position." Just 3 words, spoken without force. The soldiers did not move. They did not need further orders. Their stillness alone shifted the weight of the street. The woman who had given Harold back his cane earlier stood a few feet away, her arms crossed. Her anger had cooled into something else, a hard stillness, a refusal to look away. She was no longer shouting. She didn't need to. Harold adjusted his grip on the cane and lifted his chin faintly, angling toward the soldier's voice. "What unit are you with?" "19th Infantry, sir, Fort Lewis." The soldier's answer came crisp, without hesitation. 32 years active, still standing. A faint nod came from Harold, his face unreadable. "Then I trust you know what you're doing." The soldier allowed the smallest smile, barely visible but present in his tone. "Yes, sir." The shift was complete now. The street no longer belonged to the police officer with his nervous commands. It belonged to something deeper, older, steadier. Even those who had gathered with phones now lowered them, as though the weight of what was unfolding pressed their hands down. From across the street, someone whispered, "He's one of them." Another voice, younger, replied, "Yeah," and that cop tased him like he was nobody. The officer flinched again at the words, his shoulders sagging slightly. For the first time, his uniform seemed too large for him, as though it had stopped fitting the moment his authority slipped away. Harold's cane tapped softly against the concrete. He shifted his stance, ribs aching but his presence unbroken. He turned his head just enough toward the officer. His voice came quiet, level, stripped of heat. "You didn't need to know who I was. You just needed to listen." The silence that followed hit harder than any shout. It was not anger that landed, it was truth. The officer's breath stuttered once more, uneven. His jaw clenched, but he said nothing. Around him, the crowd's gaze pressed in, heavy, unrelenting. One of the children at the fence down the block lifted his hand in a hesitant salute. It was small, almost uncertain, but in the stillness of the street, it carried. Harold did not wave back. He simply lifted his chin slightly, a gesture that said more than words. The convoy's engines idled low, a steady heartbeat against the city's silence. None of the soldiers moved toward Harold. None needed to. Their presence alone was protection, acknowledgement, and quiet respect. The woman beside Harold spoke again, her voice softer now. "They came for you." Harold did not answer right away. He tilted his head toward the hum of engines, his expression unreadable. Finally, he murmured, "They came for something bigger than me." The soldier standing nearest shifted slightly, as though to agree, but he said nothing. For long moments, the street held still. No horns blared, no one shouted. Even the officer's radio remained silent, its crackle gone. It was as though the city itself had paused, listening to the quiet authority of the moment. Harold took one slow step toward the curb. His cane tapped softly against the pavement. The soldiers shifted their stance, not to clear a path, not to rush him forward, but as quiet acknowledgement of his movement. He walked without hurry, his steps deliberate. His ribs ached, but he did not falter. Each tap of his cane seemed to echo louder than the officer's earlier commands. The soldier who had spoken first turned his head slightly toward Harold, his voice low but firm. "Anything you need from us, sir?" "Not today," Harold answered. His tone carried both gratitude and finality. "Copy that." The words were military, simple, precise. But here they sounded like something else, like respect, like a vow kept without fanfare. The officer shifted again, dragging one boot slightly backward, as though deciding whether to step forward or retreat. His face was pale, his eyes darting to the crowd, to the convoy, then back to Harold. Finally, he forced his words into the silence, too loud, too brittle. I didn't know who he was. The words hung clumsy in the air, brittle against the truth that had already settled. Harold turned his head toward him once more, close and deliberate. His voice came quiet, but its weight filled the street. You didn't have to know, you just had to listen. No bitterness, no venom, just truth spoken plainly, without room for denial. The crowd exhaled collectively, as though the weight of the words pressed through them. No one clapped, no one cheered. They simply stood, present, letting the moment settle. The officer's shoulders sank further. He did not reach for his radio. He did not argue. He only stood there, smaller in the silence. Harold adjusted his coat once more, the cane steady in his grip. He lifted his chin slightly, his posture telling the world what words no longer needed to. And with that, the authority of the street shifted fully, irreversibly. Not by volume, not by force, by truth, carried in silence, acknowledged by all who stood witness. The convoy engines continued to hum, low and steady, as if holding the space until the moment was ready to move forward. Harold waited, unhurried, cane steady at his side, listening to the silence that had finally chosen to listen back. The low hum of the convoy filled the street for several minutes, unbroken, steady as breath. People stood still, unsure whether to leave or to hold their ground. Then another sound joined it, a quieter engine, smoother, precise. Tires rolled against asphalt, not hurried, not loud. A dark SUV pulled up behind the last truck. No sirens, no flashing lights, no urgency. The door opened, and heels clicked softly against pavement. A woman stepped out, her presence measured. Mid-50s, maybe older, her gray blazer pressed sharp, her hair pinned neatly back. She wore no name tag, no insignia, but the way the soldiers acknowledged her with a nod told the crowd enough. She crossed toward Harold, her steps even, unhurried. The block seemed to hold its breath again. Phones came up, but lower now, cautious. This was not spectacle. This was something else. Harold sat on a bench outside the bakery, his cane resting across his lap, a bottle of water loose in his hand. He could not see her approach, but he felt it. The shift in the air, the deliberate stillness of someone who commanded respect by presence alone. She stopped in front of him and folded her hands. She did not speak first. She waited. Harold tilted his head slightly, his voice low but steady. You're not from the city. No, sir, she replied. Her tone was calm, certain, stripped of pretense. I'm from Washington, Department of Veterans Affairs. That's a long way to drive for a mess like this, Harold said. We were nearby, she answered. A pause, then, and this isn't a mess anymore. There was no argument in her voice, only resolve. The officer still stood across the street, pale, silent, hands limp at his sides. His uniform looked heavier on him now, as if every seam weighed him down. The woman glanced briefly toward one of the soldiers. He stepped forward, carrying something wrapped in dark blue cloth. Carefully, he placed it on Harold's lap. Harold's fingers traced the edges of the fabric, then the smooth frame beneath it. What is this? He asked. A citation, she said softly. From a mission you were never officially part of until today. The crowd leaned closer. Even the ones with phones lowered them, realizing this was not for their screens. This was for truth. Harold's hands tightened faintly on the frame. His voice was rough. You unsealed it. We did, she replied. Not for politics, not for headlines, for truth. Her words hung steady, neither loud nor embellished. The crowd remained silent. No one clapped. No one cheered. They only listened. The woman's voice softened. You saved lives, Sergeant, a long time ago, and when you came home, you asked for very little. She glanced toward the crosswalk, just to walk across the street. A faint smile touched Harold's lips, weary but sharp. You'd be surprised how hard that's been lately. I saw, she said. The whole country will soon. Harold exhaled slowly. Not laughter, not anger, just release, his head tilted slightly toward the officer's direction. Are they going to fire him? We don't make that decision, she said. But today's footage will be reviewed by more than his department. Harold nodded once final. I don't want a speech or a plaque. The woman paused. Then gently, would you accept a sign? Harold's brow furrowed faintly. A sign? She turned her head toward the bakery wall. A maintenance crew had been working quietly behind the scenes, unnoticed until now. A ladder rested against the brick. A new street sign gleamed in the midday light. The words were simple, clean against green metal. Vance Crossing, dedicated in honor of Sergeant Harold Vance, U.S. Army 19th Infantry. For the quiet ones who carried the heavy things. Harold's fingers tightened slightly around his cane. He didn't speak. The silence said enough. The officer finally moved, each step dragging heavier than the last as he crossed the street toward the bench. He stopped a few feet away, his voice low, strained. Sir, I didn't know who you were. Harold lifted his head, his face unreadable. His voice carried steady, calm. You didn't have to know. You just had to listen. The words landed harder than any reprimand. The officer's mouth opened, then closed again. He nodded once, nothing more, and stepped back. No apology, no defense. Just truth, left hanging between them. A breeze stirred the block, brushing against faces that had watched every second unfold. Across the street, a mechanic from the tire shop lowered a flag to half staff without being asked. Children peered through the school fence, their small hands gripping the metal tight. One boy raised his hand in a salute. Not loud, not practiced, but true. Harold did not wave. He only lifted his chin slightly higher, because sometimes that was enough. The convoy did not move right away. The soldiers remained at attention, engines humming low. No orders rushed them off. They stayed because moments like this deserve time. The crowd stayed too. Phones lowered, heads bowed, some slightly, some fully. The story was no longer unfolding for their screens. It was etching itself into the pavement of the block. Harold shifted his grip on the cane and adjusted his coat. He turned his head faintly toward the sign on the wall. Though he could not see it, he felt the weight of it in the silence that followed. Vance Crossing. Not an award, not applause. A marker of dignity placed in stone and steel, where his walk had been interrupted and corrected. The woman from the VA folded her arms softly, her gaze fixed on the new sign. She said nothing more. She didn't need to. Harold sat back against the bench, the frame still resting across his lap, his fingers brushing the cloth. The water bottle at his side was nearly empty, its label peeled halfway back from where his thumb had worked at it absent-mindedly. He let the silence hold, as steady and unshaken as he had always been. The city around him had not cheered. It had not shouted. It had simply, finally, listened. And that was the kind of honor Harold Vance could accept. The soldiers held their ground. Engines hummed low, a steady background to the silence that lingered. No one hurried the moment, because everyone sensed it wasn't meant to be rushed. Across the street, the officer was gone, quietly guided aside by another official, perhaps to file a report, perhaps to sit with the weight of what he had done. No one asked. No one followed. Harold remained on the bench, his cane resting across his lap, his fingers brushing along its smooth handle. His knees ached, his shoulder throbbed from the fall. But he sat tall. Beside him, the woman from the VA stood quietly, her gaze fixed not on him, but on the green sign mounted on the bakery wall. Vance Crossing. It wasn't polished with gold or carved in stone, just clean lettering on simple metal. But its weight came from what it stood for. Not for politics, not for applause, for dignity. The crowd across the block lingered, softer now. Phones had long been lowered. Some people simply stood, present, as though the act of watching mattered more than capturing. Others bowed their heads. A mechanic still stood by the flag he had lowered to half staff, his hands resting quietly at his sides. The quiet stretched, steady and strong. Finally, Harold shifted his weight and rose slowly to his feet. His knees bent stiffly, his ribs protesting, but his balance held. The soldier nearest stepped forward, his movement precise, offering his elbow without a word. Harold accepted it, not out of need, but because sometimes dignity looked like two people walking together in silence. They moved toward the crosswalk, the same spot where it had all begun. The curb felt familiar beneath the tip of Harold's cane. He tapped it once, then again. The street lay still before him. No horns blared, no commands barked, no boots scraped nervously against pavement. Just open air and the faint hum of a city that, for a rare moment, remembered how to listen. The woman in medical scrubs appeared at the corner again, a paper bag in one hand, a steaming cup in the other. She stepped closer, her voice soft. Black, no sugar. Harold reached out, his fingers brushing the warmth of the cup. A faint smile touched his lips. You remembered. Hard to forget a man like you, she answered. He sipped, winced at the heat, then murmured with a small grin. Still too hot. Perfect, she replied. They stood together at the curb, the new sign above them. The soldiers still standing guard a short distance away. Neither spoke for a while. They simply faced the street, silent, letting the weight of the moment settle. At last, she asked quietly, How long were you in? Harold took another sip before answering. Long enough to come home and still not know if I'd ever be seen again. Her lips parted as though to answer, but she let the words rest. She didn't need to fill the silence. Harold tapped his cane lightly against the curb. His voice came low, steady. That's not what matters. She turned her head toward him. Then what does? He tapped the cane once more, then lifted his chin slightly. I got to finish my walk. The words hung quiet, simple, final. He didn't ask for medals. He didn't ask for justice. He didn't even ask for recognition. And all he wanted was the dignity of an ordinary Tuesday, uninterrupted. And at last he had it. The soldiers remained a while longer, engines humming in unison, a steady wall of presence behind him. The crowd lingered too, less like spectators now, and more like witnesses to something that would be carried away in memory instead of pixels. Eventually the trucks would roll forward. The flag at half-staff would rise again. The schoolyard voices would return to their chatter. The city would hum with its ordinary noise. But not yet. For now, the street still belonged to silence. To a blind veteran standing steady at the curb, to a sign that marked more than a crossing, to a truth spoken quietly, finally heard. Harold tapped his cane once more. The sound was small, but it carried. The city had listened, and that was enough. Some stories don't need noise to matter. They don't need applause or spectacle. They need silence, dignity, and the courage to stand steady when the world tries to push you down. Harold Vance didn't demand recognition. He only asked for the space to finish his walk. And sometimes that is the most powerful kind of victory, the quiet kind that teaches us all how to listen. If this story spoke to you, share your thoughts. Follow, like, and subscribe so more voices like Harold's can be heard. Because listening is where true change begins.